This is one of those stories that, honestly, it sounds impossible. A 17-year-old girl is the only survivor of a plane crash. She falls thousands of meters right into the middle of the Amazon rainforest, and then she walks out alive. This is the incredible true story of Juliane Köpke, and it all starts with this one absolutely terrifying realization. I mean, can you even imagine that? With just those few words, Julianne perfectly captures the sheer vertigo and confusion of that moment. One second, you're sitting in a plane cabin, and the next, you're just not. You're out in the open sky, totally alone, still strapped to your seat, and you are plummeting towards this endless sea of green. And let's just try to wrap our heads around that number. 3,000 meters. That's almost 10,000 feet. We're talking about a fall that's 20 times taller than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Surviving something like that, it's just not possible. And yet, for Giuliani, hitting the ground was only the beginning of her story. So, where did this all begin? Well, we have to go back to Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1971. The flight was Lanza 508, a pretty short domestic trip in Peru that, tragically, was pretty much doomed from the start. Julianne and her mother, Maria, were just trying to get home to celebrate Christmas with her dad, Hans Wilhelm. You know how holiday travel is. They missed some earlier flights and ended up having to book with this airline, Lanza. The thing is, her dad had specifically told them never to fly Lanza because its safety record was just awful. But it was their only way to get home in time for Christmas. It was just this catastrophic chain of events. First off, the plane itself was sketchy. People called it a Frankenstein aircraft, basically cobbled together from spare parts. Then, the pilots made a fatal choice. They flew straight into a gigantic storm cell. The turbulence was incredibly violent. Gifts, luggage, everything was flying through the cabin. People were screaming. And then, a flash of lightning hit the right wing. The fuel tank went up, the wing just ripped off, and the plane started to break apart in midair. In the middle of all that chaos and screaming, Julianne heard her mother say those words, not in a panic, but with this strange, calm finality. It was the last thing she would ever hear her mother say. The next thing she knew, the plane had left her, and she was falling. So that's the big question, right? How could any 17-year-old, especially one with a broken collarbone and a concussion, possibly survive alone in the Amazon? Well, the answer is in her childhood. For Giuliani, this wasn't some alien, terrifying place. In a really strange way, she was coming home. You see, her parents, Hans Wilhelm and Maria Köpke, were these amazing German biologists. They had moved to Peru to study its incredible biodiversity and set up a research station called Panwana deep, deep in the jungle. This was not a vacation home. This was their entire life's work. So she grew up literally as a self-described jungle child. Her parents didn't just teach her things from textbooks. The rainforest was her actual classroom. She learned real, practical survival skills, like which animals were dangerous, how to find your way, what all the different sounds of the forest meant. And all that knowledge, stuff that had been part of her since she was a little kid, was about to become her lifeline. Julianne finally woke up on Christmas Day, a full day after the crash. She's alone, she's injured, and she's in one of the most unforgiving places on the entire planet. Her 11-day journey to get out of there had just begun. Let's just take stock of her situation here, because it was bad. She had a concussion, a fractured collarbone, and some really deep cuts on her arm and leg. On top of all that, she lost her glasses, and she was severely nearsighted. So this dense, complicated jungle was basically just a big green blur. Her only supplies? A small bag of candy she managed to find in the wreckage. For the next 11 days, that was all she ate. But then, in the middle of all the pain and confusion, this one simple rule her dad had taught her just cut through the noise. Follow the water. A small stream always leads to a bigger one, which leads to a river. And where there's a river, eventually, there are people. She found a tiny spring and started following it. It was the single most important decision she was going to make. Her trek was just an incredible test of human endurance. On day 4, she stumbled upon a row of seats half buried in the ground with 3 passengers still strapped in, a truly horrifying confirmation of what had happened. For days, she just waited and sometimes swam through the stream, careful of stingrays, but knowing the caimans probably wouldn't bother her. Then, by the 9th day, all that jungle knowledge kicked in. She heard the calls of frogs and birds and she knew they only lived near big rivers. She was getting close. And on the 10th day, she found a hut and a boat. Inside, there was a can of gasoline, and this turned out to be a critical discovery. By now, a big gash on her arm was badly infected and just teeming with maggots. But she remembered seeing her dad use gasoline once to treat their dog for the same thing, so she did it. Despite what must have been agonizing pain, she poured the fuel into her own wound, forcing something like 30 maggots out. It was just this unbelievable act of survival. After spending the night in the hut, too weak to really go on, she heard something that must have sounded like angels, human voices. Her rescue was finally at hand. But the loggers who found her were absolutely terrified. I mean, you have to put yourself in their shoes. Staring back at them from the jungle was this pale, blonde girl in a torn dress covered in mud and blood. They thought she was a Yemenja, a kind of water spirit from their local legends. Her appearance was so unreal, it just froze them in their tracks. But Juliane wasn't a spirit. She was a survivor. She spoke to them in fluent Spanish and explained who she was and what had happened. Once they understood, the men immediately helped her. They tended to her wounds, they gave her food, and then took her on a 7-hour boat ride to the nearest village. From there, she was airlifted to a hospital and finally reunited with her father. But as you could imagine, the story doesn't have a perfectly happy ending. Rescuers later found the body of her mother, Maria, and the evidence suggested that she had also survived the initial crash, but was so badly injured that she died several days later, all alone in the jungle. So the ordeal was over, but its impact would shape the entire rest of her life. The jungle that had nearly killed her had also, in a very real way, saved her, and that was something she would never forget. Of course, her story quickly became a media sensation. There was this Italian film in 1974 that just completely sensationalized it, painting her as hysterical and the jungle as this movie monster full of constant spider and jaguar attacks. Juliane just called it boring and a total misrepresentation. Years later, though, she worked with the famous director Werner Herzog on a documentary called Wings of Hope. She actually went back to the crash site to tell her own story, in her own words. And she said that experience was incredibly therapeutic. It finally helped her process the trauma. During those 11 days, when she was lost and completely alone, she made a promise to herself. She vowed that if she got out of this alive, her life would mean something. It would be a life dedicated to the natural world that had both pushed her to her absolute limits and also given her the path to survival. And you know what? She absolutely kept that promise. Juliana moved to Germany, she got her PhD in biology, and became a world-renowned zoologist, just like her parents. Today, Dr. Juliane Köpke, who now goes by Juliana Diller, has taken over her parents' life's work. She runs the Penguana Research Station, fighting to protect the very same rainforest that she once had to fight for her life in. The question that hangs over this whole story has always been, why her? Out of 92 people, why was she the only one to survive? There's no scientific answer for that, but when you look at the life she's lived, it's hard not to feel like maybe, just maybe, the jungle saved one of its own, so that she, in turn, could one day save it.